Hello, everyone. This is Derek Taylor, and this is our lecture, this time on the Galileo affair. This will go along with your chapter in the textbook on cultural changes in the 17th century and early modern Europe. And Galileo affair, a crisis of expertise in the 17th century. The Galileo affair is a famous episode, of course, in the history of early modern Europe. And of course, this themes I have in the course is about how the early modern period prepares us for the coming of modernity. This is usually taken as being a sort of, clash of, of modern science versus, religion or something like this. And we're going to this in this lecture and talk about it a little from a different perspective to a certain degree. So anyway, that's the lecture. Again, if you hear any noise in the background, might be a dog barking. Apologize for that. I am doing this from my apartment. So, but let's get started with the lecture and talk about science in the early modern world a little bit, the background for what happens with Galileo. I'm sure you know the basic story. He figured out that the Earth moves around the sun and not vice versa. And this contradicted long-standing, long-held beliefs. I want to start, however, with modern day, because of course we're going through a little bit of a crisis of expertise of our own in the modern world, right? COVID wars, everybody's talking about it. What do you do about it? How do you treat it? Ask the experts, right? Experts must know. We all want something to do about something like this, diseases. That's important to modern people. We like our modern medicine. It works. It's good. It's part of the greatness, the goodness of being in a modern society, and not one in which if you break your arm, you die. So this is something where we have this pandemic come upon us, and we're not necessarily prepared for it. And of course, as I'm sure you're aware, there's lots of disagreements about what to do about this, to say the very least. Not just you can say among experts, but of course, this leads to, of course, conflicts between experts and, well, people who don't like what the experts have to tell them. I won't belabor this. Only I want to make, again, the comparison, what's going to be talking about with Galileo and his time frame. Serious disagreements about matters of scientific study. But another one I thought I'd throw in there, something else that's going on in the world right now, disconcerting notion, which is the study of genetics, right? Mapping out the human genome, stuff like this. This is from a little article in the New Yorker about Catherine Page Harden, who's a geneticist. Very photogenic, a nice photo there, but she's written a book recently on this. And again, of course, this is a topic, right? Are we just the sort of automatons we're determined by our genes, or are they just totally irrelevant? This is, of course, this magazine's kind of progressive, so it's like, do progressives care about genetics? And I mentioned this because, of course, that's a big thing, right? We all like freedom of choice. That's a modern thing, I guess, in a way. But reason why there's this problem, and the book deals with that, is that the study of human intelligence with regards to genetics is going in directions that they're going to upset some people, because what they're finding more and more is that, yeah, intelligence is genetically inheritable. And this will touch on some very sensitive areas, to say the least, because in our modern society, of course, we think everyone is equal. This would be a real serious clash. It's going to be, by the way. That's the way it's going. I'm not an expert on that at all, but you know enough about it. They don't like talking about it, these scientists, for obvious reasons. But it's there. It's there, and it's very real. And my point is to try to get us into the mindset of what's going on in Galileo's day, where you're having a crisis of knowledge in an age where you don't know which experts to trust, because they seem to be undermining things that are, again, your perspective, probably not religious in that sense, but maybe sacred. There are clearly people who take things like social equality as if they were religious in terms of their intensity, but they're in flux. And in fact, in the 17th century. Those terms, we'll get to the term, scientific revolution. That's why we use that term, right? Because the changes that go on in the 16th and 17th centuries are so profound. We call them revolutionary. There are debates about, among historians of science, whether you should use that term. It is a long process. We'll go with it. It's fine. Also, you may have heard the term paradigm shift in your life. If you haven't, this comes from the scientist and philosopher Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which he basically said that in a set of beliefs will hold during periods of normalcy. That is, when there's not destabilizing social, cultural changes going on, until new facts or theories expose anomalies between the existing theories and known facts. And this will lead to what he calls a paradigm shift from one set of mental ideas, structures to the other. It's been criticized, but it is kind of what's going on in the 17th century. Huge shift. That's what we talk about when we talk about the growth of modernity, is stuff like this. Early modernity. And in fact, what happens is there is a sea change in beliefs about the physical world, about the nature, the structure of our world physically, from the 16th to 18th centuries. And in particular, the way I'm framing it here for you is that older theories of nature are going to be replaced by mechanistic ones. The other things involved besides mechanistic ideas, but that's a biggest shift in a lot of ways, as you'll see. And one thing to talk about here, I'll mention in passing, and I'm going to come back to it in broad, but to talk about this is, this is usually presented as a narrative of a decline of religion. And in fact, that's not the way most historians of science see it anymore, at least the ones that are knowledgeable. In fact, most historians understand now that Protestant Christianity played a role in discrediting the belief in things like magic in the 16th and 17th centuries. In fact, to a lesser extent, Catholic authorities did as well. The Catholic Counter-Reformation Church made efforts to suppress what they thought was superstitious ideas. And both of these forces saw magic as idolatrous. And in fact, most historians have come to realize that, yeah, this actually paves the way for something like the growth of modern science. And in fact, virtually every thinker we're going to talk about here is a believer of one sort or another. Some of them very devout, as we'll get to, but none of these people are atheists in the slightest, as you'll see in this narrative. I'm simplifying things for you by calling this the old natural philosophy, but in general, nature is discernible by reason. And by reason, I mean abstract reasoning, right? You can discern the world from in your mind by thinking about it. And one of the things you discern about it is that it's concerned with philosophical principles. You can discern the principles of the natural world. Natural philosophy means studying nature that way, where you study the principles underlying the material realities that come to you via the senses, rather than through observing of those particular sensible realities from the senses, what you can taste, touch, smell, and all other stuff. And in particular, coming from the medieval world, and I don't have time to point it out here, the medievals did have a form of science. Not our form of science, they did have science. So again, it may not seem that way, and wouldn't be correct today, but they did have it in its own way. They, of course, took as their starting point authoritative books like Aristotle. Hey, Aristotle had figured out what the principles of nature were. Principles of nature don't change. So why would you get rid of the old books? You start with the old books. You don't do, in other words, you deduct from those first principles to conclusions about nature. I mentioned this because this basically discourages things like, well, experiments, that's how we do this in the modern world, obviously. And of course, authoritative books give you wisdom about the world, about the whole of nature. And this, as you'll see very clearly, this also, to the ancients and to the medievals, right up through Galileo's time, this means that nature itself, the physical world, has a purpose. You can discern the telos. Telos is we'll get to Aristotle in a second, the ends or purposes for which things are made or exist. And therefore, it has kind of a moral status in a way. It's not merely, as you're going to see, indifferent stuff. We'll get to that in a moment, how that we come to view it that way. I say we, the modern world views it that way. This all, of course, goes back to Aristotle. He's the great thinker of the ancient world. For him, knowledge begins in the senses, but through reasoning, you can discern the telos of the objects which you see, the purpose or the ends of objects in the world. And this is the crucial part. Aristotle is a realist in the sense that from this, abstraction from these sensory data, you can get ideas about the world that will mirror its actual structure. That is to say, you can have some confidence that you know what the world outside your own ego looks like. And that is what most people assume until you get to the 16th and 17th centuries. What changed? Well, I'll give you an example of this. From his physics, one, when the objects of an inquiry in any department have principles, conditions, or elements, it is through acquaintance with these that knowledge, that is to say, scientific knowledge, is attained. Keep that in mind. Science for Aristotle and for the ancients of the Middle Ages is knowing those principles. In the science of nature, as other branches of studies, our first task will be to try to determine what relates to its principles. One way of understanding the world. Now, what's going to change by the end of this period, and which Galileo will be a key part of, as you're going to see, did not encourage experimentation. This is repetitive. Why is this here? Again, I'll skim past this. But that's the picture I want you to take away here. Is a different thing. What's going to happen is a new model of what knowledge is will appear in the 16th and 17th centuries. In general, three things. One, it asserts a mechanistic view of nature, the world and machine. It's not a natural thing that has purposes or telos built into it. It's just stuff. The material world is just inert matter, if you like. And again, I don't have time to go into this, but Aristotle posited all these terms and ideas, and his successors did in the Middle Ages, about everything having its own form and its all this stuff goes away. Matter, mark on the wall, is just stuff, inert things. Second thing to note here is that you have a mathematical term, as you're going to see. Galileo's at the heart of this, being the idea that what you can know about nature or the material world are its primary qualities, meaning ones that can be deduced from mathematics, things you can measure precisely. Those are the volume, weight, all other stuff. Anything else is secondary. And those secondary qualities, this is very important here, as you're going to see from this, the ancients thought of things like harmony, beauty, order, those things as being part of the first principles, as being objective. All those sorts of things are going to be banished to the subjective realm by these modern thinkers. Only the mathematical, the calculable, can be known with certainty. And what follows from this, as you can kind of get, is a reductive view of nature, comparatively speaking. It's very much reduced to what can be known in that very narrow manner. And he was not a scientist. He was a mathematician. So we have to mention René Descartes here. René Descartes, one of the founders of modern rationalistic philosophy. And of course, he was the one who had a problem, right? How do you know? How can you be certain about what you know? And this is the problem of skepticism in the 16th, 17th centuries. Again, you have these old systems breaking down. Aristotle was a brilliant man. His system, lasted for so long because it was a solid foundation. So when that falls, what do? So what Descartes does in his philosophy, to dumb this down for you in 5 minutes or less, is to, instead of starting with the external world, with nature itself, start with, the self. Start with what he calls epistemological doubt. That means, doubting for the sake of argument, basically. Whereas then, what can I not doubt in my own mind? If I'm here, I'm patting my head, I know I have my diploma on the wall, so I know I have a PhD. It's right next to me, actually, here. What can I not doubt if I'm thinking? Well, the thing I can't doubt is that I'm thinking. And so you begin from the idea that you are the thing that is sturdy and solid, not the external world. Hence his phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. That's going to be the starting point for understanding nature. It will be as a projection, if you like, of your subjective consciousness on the world. And the consequence of this is that you're going to have a real hard and fast separation between the thinking self, which is a sort of separate being from the world, and the world itself. And that's one of the consequences of Descartes' method. You become alien from the world. In Aristotle's world, you're a part of nature. You're a rational animalist. Now you become the only sort of thinking being, basically, in the natural world. Everything else is just mechanical automatons. Every other animal. And the new model of knowledge, the way you gain knowledge, is a vast change from all of this. Instead of starting with those general principles, which, again, the modern way of knowing, you can't know that stuff anyway, you start from observation of the natural world, from the observation of the senses. You start where Aristotle starts, but that's the starting point itself, rather than you start from the abstractions from that. You start from the sensory data, things that, and you go from that to mathematical calculations of what it can be. Hence, knowledge comes from observation and following a method, scientific method. Descartes writes a book called on method. And with Galileo as a part of this as well. A shift toward this, as well as scientific method, means experimentations, doing experiments where you weigh out these very different hypotheses. And this is how you get certain knowledge. Certain knowledge is independent of your whatever, that's independent, not from knowledge, rational knowledge of first principles. This is the change, of course. And what, of course, this leads to, in a way, is a very changed view of the natural world. The notion that the world itself, apart from our minds, is a meaningful order, that it has some sort of ultimate meaning that can be inferred from the universe apart from our responses to it, is sometimes said to have been lost in the coming of modern science. This is the idea of disenchantment. It's a word. It's invented in the 18th century by Friedrich Schiller. It means, the German word's Entzauberung. You didn't know that, but it literally means the demagification of nature, or the purging of magic from nature. Nature is no longer the source. Like, again, in this older vision, you're supposed to go to nature as a source, right? It's something where you find yourself in the natural world and all that stuff. With modern science, with the coming of this modern notion of scientific endeavor, it becomes this inert place where it's just there to be manipulated by the human mind and the human will. That's one way of looking at it. I'm dumbing it down for the sake of time. And a lot of the thinkers that pushed this do so with the aim of producing greater control over nature. Sir Francis Bacon, who we'll get to in a second, empiricist, I don't think you can call him philosopher, writer, philosopher maybe, scientist definitely not, said that, quote, knowledge is the rich storehouse for the glory of the creator and the relief of man's estate. You've probably heard phrases attributed to Sir Francis Bacon, knowledge is power. He never said it. At least I haven't been able to find it. The other quote that's attributed to him is that he wanted to put nature to the torture and get her to yield up her secrets. He never said this, but the basic idea is true. He wants power over nature in order to relieve man's estate. René Descartes, in his discourse on method, says something similar. He says, if you follow this method of learning about the world, breaking it down into little bits and pieces of sensory data, and then building a picture on the basis of that through our subjective view of the world, we will become, quote, the masters and possessors of nature, unquote. And again, he wasn't talking in some sinister way. He wanted to, again, remember, this is a world in which if you break your arm, you can die. So they have that in mind. but does mean a very changed view of how the natural world works. And Galileo is at the center of this. I had to go through all that to get you guys to understand this, but I'll give you one last example of the reductive nature of modern science. This is from Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, 20th century philosopher, quote, "Physics is mathematical, not because we know so much about the physical world, but because we know so little. It is only its mathematical properties that we can discover. For the rest, our knowledge is negative." And what he means there, and this is important to keep in mind for the Galileo affair especially, there's a trade-off in modern science. We get rid of ideas like beauty and order and principles, and even first fatalist stuff. We're going to only focus narrowly on what we can measure and calculate with precision, which is something much more easy for us to replicate. It's useful, but it means that we're narrowing the range of what we can know about the world. That's the trade-off. You can know lots of stuff, it's very useful, but you leave all those other questions behind. You get beyond that, and you're getting out beyond the realm of science in a modern sense. All right, so that's a little introduction to the scientific revolution. Now, okay, how do you go from that, from the Aristotelian, I'm again overgeneralizing for the sake of time, more than Aristotle prior to 17th century. How do you go from this? Well, by the late 16th century, you're having competing visions because the Aristotelian framework is already under attack in the late 16th centuries for discussing of nature, and particularly as you'll see with, the notion of the heavens with Galileo and the model of the universe. And so, of course, it's breaking down what's going to replace it. Well, there are several things that can replace it. One thing that might replace it is what's called empiricism, emerges in the Renaissance. Empiricism, again, is the idea that all knowledge comes from the senses, but also there are variations on this, and just unlike Aristotle, who starts with that and goes somewhere else, staying just with that. And this begins in other places, but probably earliest in Italy, late 16th century. People like Bernardino Telesio was a philosopher, natural scientist, wrote two major works, one as early as 1565 on nature according to its own principles. Another one, a complete edition of this appears in the 1580s, eventually be put on the prohibited index of forbidden books by the Catholic Church. But the big assertion here in that book is the only way to understand the things in the natural world is to study the nature itself. And this should be done with attention to the physical properties of matter, particularly the aspects of hot and cold. And again, I won't go into too much detail, but it means you start with that and you just talk about that rather than the sort of Aristotelian, I won't go through it in detail, Aristotelian concepts that were associated with natural philosophy in the universities at that time. And so he's one of the first to make this break with Aristotelian natural philosophy. Telesio is. Another thinker, a very strange man, Tommaso Campanella. It should be, I misspelled that, Campanella, Campanella, CA. I'll correct it when I post this. Post the slides. I guess I'll correct it. Well, okay, I won't correct it then. Never mind. He's an Italian philosopher who tried to reconcile humanism, Renaissance humanism, with Catholic theology. A very weird guy. Was a Dominican priest. This is the order of preachers, a religious order in the Catholic Church, who began publishing in the 1590s this empiricist idea that philosophy comes through the senses. Wrote a book called, in English, Philosophy Demonstrated by the Senses in 1591. And it stressed the necessity for human experience as the basis of philosophy, and experience as sensory experience. For this, he was arrested and tried and briefly imprisoned for heresy. He's released, went to the city of Padua, where he was arrested, charged with sodomy, acquitted, then went off and was arrested again for having engaged for debating matters of Christian faith with a Jewish person. Again, he was sent for trial, he was acquitted. But he had a lot of weird things to write. One of the things he wrote about, and especially his early writings, was that the sinful nature of humanity could be overcome by founding basically a religious utopia, more or less, I put in those terms. He was big into sort of plans of religious reform, so much so that he got put into prison in 1599 for trying to overthrow the government, the Spanish government of Calabria in Italy. And in prison, he wrote a utopian work called the City of the Sun, La Città del Sol. And I mention all this because his idea was this ideal commonwealth be governed by men of enlightened reason. Everyone's work would be, everyone would have all the same stuff. There'd be no private property. There'd be no excessive wealth. There'd be no poverty itself. It'd be gone because everybody would only have what they needed. If this sounds like a sort of quasi-communist, it is. It's a utopian ideal based on a lot of weird ideas that he has, but he's also basing it on human experience, so that's why he's an empiricist. But the man we, especially in the Anglophone world, associate with empiricism is a man named Sir Francis Bacon, who was a philosopher of sorts. One of his secretaries, a man named Thomas Hobbes, you may have heard of him, another later thinker, once said, was asked what kind of philosopher the Sir Francis Bacon, who had been Lord Chancellor, he was a big he was a politician. He asked him what kind of philosopher he had been, and his response was that he had been a good Lord Chancellor. But while he was a lawyer studying at Cambridge, he became dissatisfied with the old Aristotelian philosophy of nature, and he begins to propagate. And that's really he's really a propagandist. He's not a scientist. He doesn't do experiments, but he writes essays, famous essays, interesting essays, in which he argues for an inductive philosophy, which starts with the data of sensible experience, only to be corrected by a method, not by first principles of nature, anything like that, but which constitute such data as facts. Like he uses the word fact, factum in Latin. And again, it's important to note here that that word doesn't come from anything from philosophy or science. It comes from law. A factum is something that's done or made, and it gets transformed in his writings and others into something to find in nature. Kind of interesting idea. And he writes several books propagandizing for this. The Great Instauration, the Novum Organum. Novum Organum refers to a work by Aristotle called the Organum, so he's talking about renovating, Aristotle's work. A new philosophy for a new world, if you like. And of course, there's Robert Boyle. You may recognize that name, Boyle's Law. This is the guy, great scientist of the 17th century in England. He was a genuine scientist and thinker in that way. But he was particularly famous for advocating the use of experimentation, for conducting scientific experiments as we understand them, in order to establish knowledge. Again, that's one of the big dividing lines is you don't start with first principles, you build your principles on empirical data. And that's exactly what he was interested in. And in fact, he has a sort of missionary zeal in spreading them. If you don't know, Robert Boyle was a very pious and devout Protestant, raised in a Puritan household. And he is one of the most esteemed figures of the scientific community of the 17th century, along with several other prominent amateur scientists. He founds the Royal Society, it's the exact phrase, in this 1663, where he and other gentlemen amateurs will conduct experiments and publish their findings in the Transactions of the Royal Society, which still exist. They're both still in existence. And they help spread this ideal of inductive science across Europe, and so popularized Bacon's theories and his empiricism. So that's one alternative in Galileo's day. Another is the revival of ancient atomism. Ancient atomism is the theory that basically everything in nature can be explained by the collision of atoms in motion, bouncing into each other. And it comes from the thinking of Epicurus, who was an ancient Hellenistic philosopher from the ancient world, ancient Greece. His texts were basically lost to Western Europe for a variety of reasons. They were resuscitated in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so you're going to have people latch onto this idea of atomism. And in particular, people they're going to try to make it reconcilable with Christian theology. One of the most famous thinkers, important thinkers for this, is Pierre Gassendi, a French scientist. And oh, by the way, that's Father Gassendi to you. He was a Catholic priest. He sought to reconcile not just Epicureanism, but Stoicism, other things with Christian theology. With his, again, he's an empiricist as well. He thinks these ideas come through the senses, but he will build this idea of science as a sort of probabilistic endeavor, meaning your theories are always subject to revision from further evidence and data coming in, because it's based on that ultimately. And in fact, if you're wondering the reason why he's so interested in it, one of the reasons why this may sound odd, right? Atomism, Epicurean philosophy, it's kind of atheistic. The gods don't have anything to do with nature. One of the reasons why it's compatible with people like Gassendi, but also Robert Boyle, is that it provides a mechanistic explanation for the universe, right? Because somebody has to set those atoms in something or someone has to set those atoms in motion. For people like Gassendi and Boyle, of course, it's God who creates the world by setting the atoms in motion. So it appeals to a certain, if you have a voluntaristic idea of God, voluntarism just means something to do with the will. That's the voluntas, is the Latin word for will. If you primarily think of God as being defined by his will, this makes perfect sense. As it does for Boyle, who is also an atomist in the same way, as well as other people who were definitely involved in chemistry in the 17th century, people like Daniel Sennert, whose name I don't provide there. He's not as important as Boyle, but this is a way of getting to nature. The other way that's wildly popular in the 17th century, even among people we think of as being founders of modern science, quite frankly, is the occult. And no, I'm not kidding. Magic and alchemy were the pursuit of mystical analogies between man and the cosmos, the macrocosm, microcosm, if you know what I'm talking about. The search for magical powers over nature in things like alchemy, the concoction of elixirs and stuff like this. In the 16th century, Paracelsus, a German thinker, was an advocate of stuff like this. But it had advocates in England, a guy named Robert Flood, who was an occultist, who was a contemporary of Bacon, was into this stuff. But also people like Giordano Bruno. If you don't know who Giordano Bruno was, he was a philosopher, astronomer, and definitely an occultist. He was into some weird ideas. He was into magic. He apparently worshipped the Egyptian god Thoth. Thoth was the god of magic. I don't know how serious that was. And but he was also a guy who had some wild ideas. He it was one of the first people to posit that the universe was infinite. Again, I forgot, we'll get to this in a second. The old Aristotelian view of nature, Ptolemaic view of the universe, that is static, it doesn't change, and it's only of a certain size. He says it's not. He also rejects. He also rejects weirdly the Copernican theory and advocates an idea of a multiplicity of worlds. He was a real weirdo. He's sometimes taken to be a martyr for science or something like that. He was not a scientist at all. He decided to be a martyr because he was executed by the Catholic Church for heresy, which, by the way, he may be the only person I've ever heard of who was excommunicated by the Catholic Church, by the Lutheran churches, and the Calvinist Church. It's 3 times. He had the trifecta there. But he was not a scientist, really. But this is the key thing to note here, is that virtually every scientist you can think of and name in the 17th century had some interest in things like magic and alchemy. Albert Boyle, great scientist, Boyle's Law, had a lifelong fascination with witches. He kept a book in which he talked about witches and stories about witches and witchcraft. Sir Isaac Newton, we'll get to the end of this lecture, spent the latter part of his life investigating the Bible because he thought it was an alchemical code that gave you access to secrets of the universe. This stuff is everywhere. And the Janus space of early modern science, that's the reference to a great book by a great historian of scientists, Betty Jo Dobbs, the late Betty Jo Dobbs, who wrote several books on Newton's obsession with alchemy, which was, I don't have time to go into this, was actually essential to his entire project. It sounds crazy. It actually mattered a lot more to him than what he's famous for. So all this is in the background of what's going on. That's the kind of flux things are in when Galileo steps into the breach. So let's talk about Galileo's role in this revolution and in the Copernican revolution, where our ideas of the heavens are overthrown and we are brought to this very different way of looking at things. Now, the old Ptolemaic world picture, you know who Ptolemy was? Ptolemy was a mathematician in the early late Hellenistic period, 100, 170 AD, actually Roman period. So 107, dies in 170 AD. About 150, he writes the Almagest and planetary hypotheses as works, in which he basically gives you this modified notion of Aristotle's system of the world, in which is, you know, geocentric, the Earth's at the center, the planets move around it, but it's also static and hierarchical. The planets are carried around the center of the universe, embedded in unchangeable material, invisible spheres at fixed distances. All planets have the same center of motion. And so the universe is made of nested concentric spheres of bodies, which have to travel in a uniform motion along the most perfect path possible. And I mentioned this word perfection. That's an idea that really motivates a lot of these thinkers. So you get to Galileo, all of them. He makes some modifications, does Ptolemy, to Aristotle's model. Aristotle's model had some problems. It couldn't account for things like variations in apparent brightness between planets, even if distances were always the same. And moreover, the paths of the moon, the sun, and the planets as observed from Earth are not circular. And again, the reason why they had to be circular is because the circle is the notion of perfection for the ancients. Again, their idea of science is, you know, again, so alien to us because it's inflected by these value notions. And so he explains these imperfections, these perceived imperfections of our senses, by postulating that apparently irregular movements were a combination of several regular circular motions seen in perspective from a stationary Earth. This involved three different types of mechanisms. One, a uniformly revolving off-center circles called eccentrics. You can sort of see that. I don't know if that in there in the model we have there. Epicycles. Epicycles are little circles who move uniformly on the circles of larger radii. Here, deferent. And then equants. Equants are sort of like imaginary points from which you view these things, which are sort of, you know, they're mathematical abstractions meant to make something work and save appearances, as it were. That phrase will come back into this. And his idea of the equant was very controversial. Some people rejected this, some Islamic astronomers. And later, Copernicus will as well. However, this system works for the better part of several thousand years, as far as people understand. This is good science. It fit observation better than anything else. And that's why it lasted for so long. You have to point that out. It was probably the best you could come up with before the 16th and 17th centuries. Here, just to give you another notion of the spheres. One thing to note about the idea of the universe before Galileo is, again, the Earth's the center. Things that are at the center are lower, more earthly, weighted down. Things that are more heavenly, that are higher up, are made of different materials. Again, there's this idea that what's higher must be better, so it's different. And by the way, what's lower is worse. Sometimes you still hear this idea that, well, it's egocentric to have man at the center of the universe. It was quite the opposite for the medievals, for example. Man's worse because he's more earthly at the bottom. But this idea is going to play into this, and Galileo will actually disprove this idea himself. So now we come to the brass tacks here, come to Nicholas Copernicus, Polish astronomer who basically proposed that planets have the sun as a fixed point to which their motions are being referred. He's the first one to hit on this idea that, yeah, it's the planets that go around the sun and also turn daily on its own axis. The planets do. And that slow long-term changes in the direction of this axis will account for precession of things like precession of equinoxes. The final version of this theory, he hits in 1543. By the way, he still retains the idea that the orbits of the planets are circular. Why? Because it's more perfect. And I should mention, by the way, oh yeah, he's a canon of a cathedral. Again, he's kind of a Catholic priest. And in fact, he dedicates his book to Pope Paul III. His book causes very little controversy when he puts it out in 1543. In fact, when it's published first, someone adds a preface to it, a guy named Andreas Osiander, who's a Protestant. He's not, he's Catholic, he was. And which stated that the theory in his book was only a mathematical hypothesis. And the reason why is, traditionally speaking, the geometrical constructions of astronomers had been seen only as hypothetical. The cosmological interpretations of the heavens were reserved for philosophers. So this was a normal way of receiving this stuff. And the reception was mixed. People pretty much rejected the heliocentric hypothesis out of hand, but the book was very sophisticated in its mathematical calculations. So those were transferred almost immediately into geocentric theories. It takes a whole generation for people to begin to, for practicing astronomers to begin to accept a heliocentric idea, or at least talk about it that way. And the reason for this is, besides the sort of weight of tradition of that older theory, is that on the face of it, you have to understand something about the heliocentric theory. Just go outside and look at the sun and ask yourself, if you didn't know this, because you're taught this from the time you're kids, that the sun, the earth revolves around the sun. If you see the sun going across the sky, you'd naturally think the sun was moving around the earth. It fits with a common sense, sensory observation. And again, it's one of the things to note about modern science is that it may begin with observation. It goes way beyond our sensory experience. And of course, these thinkers had all grown up on this Aristotelian idea of the heavens and the earthly region being different, right? The heavens are perfect, earth is corrupt. That stuff's all in their mind. There was, of course, another problem. And that problem is that there are passages in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially, where the sun is stationary and the earth is moving. Where the earth is stationary and the sun is moving, which clashes with this idea. Both Protestants and Catholics alike often dismissed heliocentrism on this basis. Famously, Martin Luther dismissed this idea in one of his so-called table talks before his death. And in fact, you're going to see one of the things that's going to make this controversial eventually is that when then Copernicus had initially published his book on the revolution of the heavenly spheres. That's what that Latin title means, by the way. Sorry, I didn't explain that. It's on the revolution of the heavenly spheres. Is that the Roman Inquisition was founded only in 1542. So there wasn't the heightened scrutiny. Remember, it's 1542 and 1543. These things are, before the Council of Trent. After the Council of Trent, there's a lot more emphasis on uniformity in terms of Catholic thought. So there's going to be more heightened scrutiny going forward on things like this. And plus another reason is that in the late 16th century, there'll be an alternative model to Copernicus's invented by a Danish astronomer named Tycho Brahe, which is essentially a hybrid geostatic heliocentric system in which the moon and the sun go around the earth, but the planets still go around the sun. And you sort of preserve the elegance and harmony of the Copernican system married to the stability and centrality of the earth, which allowed people to maintain Aristotelian notions of physics of nature. And he also made great observations. He had an observatory on an island in Denmark called, he called his observatory Uraniborg after Urania, the muse of astronomy. And so, yeah, he collects all these wonderful observations. And in fact, he has several scholars working with him, assistants, one of whom is Johannes Kepler. Excuse me. And it's Kepler really who begins the big break with the ancient world, in the sense that he's a convinced Copernican in his theories, but he'll defend it by kind of going beyond it to a certain degree. He gives priority to mathematics in the structure of the universe. And excuse me, he'll also change this idea. He's the first person to abandon this idea that the planets must travel in a circular nature. And he will actually say his laws of planetary motion are basically three. He doesn't call them laws, but planets move in elliptical orbits, with the sun at its center. The time necessary for these things to go around an arc are proportional to the area between the central body and the arc, area law. and that there's an exact relationship between the squares of the planet's periodic times, and the cubes of the radii of their orbits, the harmonic law. But all this is revolutionary. Why? Because it breaks this idea that the circle is perfect. By the way, he's still doing it for those reasons, though. He still thinks of this as being more perfect than the Copernican system. He thinks that a system which hints at a dynamic, changing universe. That's the other thing about this older view of a Ptolemaic universe. It's static. It doesn't change. He thinks this is more to the glory of the Creator, because Kepler is deeply religious. He's a Lutheran. Unless Reformed, or I can't remember which one. I don't think he's a Calvinist. I think he's a Lutheran. But he was actually trained as a theologian initially. And in fact, he sees this as almost an extension of his theological training. This is a quote from one of his letters. I wanted to become a theologian for a long time. I was restless. Now, however, behold how through my effort, God is being celebrated in astronomy. He thinks of this as being more perfect than the older model. He's still thinking in those terms. This latest, he dies in 1630, and he corresponds with Galileo. Galileo is actually very dismissive towards him for the first part of it. I don't know why, but it's his theories of planetary motion that are some ways the first breakthrough, which will also, of course, be seconded as we get to with Galileo. Finally, this, by the way, is a model of the Tychonian view of the universe. This is hypothesis Tychonica. Here you have the Earth center, you have the sun, the planets going around the sun, and the sun traveling around the Earth. For a long time, by the way, this Tychonian system was embraced by actively religious people in the church, Catholic Church, for example. Also, many Protestants. This was a good alternative to them because it saved traditional ideas for them, and it was a perfectly workable system as well until you get again unto finally what 45 minutes into this, maybe Galileo himself. He comes onto the scene. He's born in 1564, dies in 1642. He is from Tuscany, from Pisa in Italy, son of a musician. He will matriculate at the University of Paris, and eventually, not Paris, Pisa, excuse me. But he'll leave without having to obtain his degree. So don't feel bad if you don't get your degree. You can go on and become a genius scientist and mathematician. For several years, he gives private lessons. He eventually begins his studies on motion. He gets turned down for his first application for a job, but he begins to grow his reputation as a mathematician. And finally, through the good services of a noble patron, a guy named Guidobaldo del Monte, obtains the chair of mathematics at the University of Pisa in 1589. I mention this because it's going to be very important for his career. He's very good, because remember, outside of universities, there's really no places until you get to the Royal Society in the late 17th century to do science. You're on your own. And the people in the universities are hidebound. They don't like the challenges, as you'll see, to risk-taking philosophy. In any case, it's there that he starts doing the famous, experiments with the dropping of different weights and that sort of thing, at least according to his biographer. He writes a manuscript on motion, which shows him already abandoning Aristotelian notions of motion. But he attacked Aristotle a lot, which made him unpopular with colleagues. And so 1592, they let him go. They don't renew his contract. However, his patrons, again, his aristocratic patrons, secure him the chair of mathematics at Padua, University of Padua, where he teaches from 1592 to 1610. And again, one of the things to note about Galileo is that his salary went up, but he still had a lot of responsibilities. His father had died in 1591. So he's the head of the family. He has to provide for the rest of his family. It means he's chronically pressed for money, even as he keeps doing these experiments. He does have a child, a couple of children under wedlock. He never marries. So he's got lots of expenses. So he does need money. And what's going to happen is that he is going to become a court philosopher and mathematician. His career will take off in 1609 when he hears about the construction in the Netherlands of an instrument that had been invented to show you things nearby, the telescope. By trial and error, he basically figures out how they did it, makes his own, teaches himself how to grind spyglass lenses, and then sets up making increasingly powerful telescopes. In August of 1609, he presents an 8-power telescope to the Venetian Senate. The Venetian Republic was ruling Padua at the time. And he's rewarded with life tenure at the University of Padua and a doubling of his salary. He was now one of the highest paid people in the university. That fall, he goes on to identify to observing the heavens with a telescope that magnifies up to 20 times. And in December, he draws the phases of the moon as seen through the telescope. And this is very important because he shows the moon's surface is not smooth as had been thought, but rough and uneven. Why is that important? But again, the moon was supposed to be made of higher material, more perfect. Therefore, it wasn't supposed to have any imperfections, no rough edges. He proved there were mountains on the actual moon. Again, that the heavens were just like the earth. And in fact, one interesting side note, there's a scholar named Michael Edgemont who pointed out that before he actually proved this, he actually made these drawings before he had a telescope that was really all that powerful enough to see the actual mountains on the moon. And what he figured out was he must have done this by looking at the shadows on the sides of the mountains and calculating their distances. And he learned to do that, not from reading Aristotle, obviously, but from learning how to draw. He learned how to do, like, it's called disegno, I think is the way it is, in doing black and white drawings. So his training as a courtier is what, as an artist, is what gave him access to understand this stuff initially. In January of 1610, he, of course, discovered 4 moons revolving around Jupiter. And he also found that there were more stars than we thought visible to the naked eye. These discoveries were earth-shattering because they basically proved once and for all Aristotelian framework was wrong, more or less. Publishes a book called the Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, in which he describes them. He dedicates this work, by the way, to Cosimo II de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, whom he had been a tutor to in mathematics before. And he names the Jupiter after the Medici family, calls them the Sidera Medici, the Medicean stars. This is a great way of sucking up to a potential patron, which of course he gets rewarded. He becomes the mathematician and philosopher to the Duke of Tuscany. Again, this is actually a book written years ago by a guy named Mario Baggioli, Galileo the Courtier. Again, there's nowhere else to get real serious work from other than these courtiers. I'll come back to this because this is a part of this story. And so it's after this point in 1610 that he begins to start defending, because he's living the life of a gentleman. He's got money now, serious money. He comes to start defending the Copernican theory. And again, it's important to note this. What he has done so far is disprove Aristotle's cosmology. He has not yet proved that the Earth is a planet orbiting the sun. He has not proved the heliocentric theory is correct. But because he begins seeing stuff through his telescope, he becomes convinced that that Copernicus was right. 1613, he writes a letter to his student, Benedetto Castelli in Pisa, about the problem of trying to square the Copernican theory, this time with certain biblical passages. What happens is that some copies of this, inaccurate copies, will be sent by Galileo's enemies. And I should mention this, by the way, when we're talking about this debate, because there's a serious debate by the early 1600s, we're talking about a debate within the Catholic Church. The popes have their own astronomers in the Vatican. None of them agree on this. They all have different sides. And there are different astronomers writing back and forth. And Galileo is just one of them. In any case, his enemies send copies of these letters to the Inquisition in Rome. He has to retrieve the letter and send accurate copies. Several Dominican priests lodge complaints against him in Rome. And he actually will write an expanded version of his letter to Castelli, now addressed to the Grand Duchess Christina, in which he will talk about, excuse me, in 1613, discusses the problem of how to interpret biblical passages with regard to scientific discoveries. Except for one example, he doesn't actually do it. And in fact, one of the things he's up against is that from the Council of Trent, the task of interpreting the Bible has been, limited to approved theologians, right? This is part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, right? Make sure people don't go crazy with the Bible. In fact, in that letter, he will actually take up a position on Scripture that had been taken up by St. Augustine of Hippo back in the earlier period. Basically, that literally every passage, not every passage in Scripture needs to be taken literally, particularly the Scripture in question is a book of poetry or instructions or history. He's basically saying, we'll come back to this, that, well, if it's a question of astronomy, only astronomers should be allowed to interpret it. We'll come back to that. In any case, by 1615, the tide's turning against Copernican theory. That same year, another cleric, Paolo Antonio Foscorini, publishes a book arguing that the Copernican theory did not conflict with Scripture. As a result, the Inquisition examined the question and pronounced the Copernican theory to be heretical. They banned Foscarini's book, as well as some other books. One of Kepler's books on Copernican astronomy, and they issued a suspension of Copernicus on the revolution of the heavenly spheres. And if I haven't mentioned this before, the Inquisition is a legal body, right? It's meant to determine what's orthodox and what's not. So keep that in mind. It's not some sort of terror instrument or anything like that. In 1616, things had reached a head for Galileo. I kind of got the serial mentioned earlier, didn't I? Should have had earlier. Anyway, but 1616, I say, called before the Inquisition. He actually goes to Rome to try to persuade the Inquisition not to ban his ideas. In the end, he has a friend there, a cardinal named Robert Bellarmine, is instructed on the orders of the Inquisition to order him not to, quote, hold or defend, unquote, the idea that the earth moves and the sun stands still at the center. He could talk about it. The decrees did not prevent Galileo from discussing heliocentrism as a hypothesis. He could not talk about it as if it were already known to be true. That was the distinction. And it's worth talking about here for a second, because you have this idea. Bellarmine writes a letter to Foscarini that same year, 1616, in which he basically says that you have talked in hypothetical terms, and that's a good thing. Because it's one thing to talk about this as a hypothetical. It's another thing to talk about as if it's already, as if it's actually a reality. And I don't have the quotation in front of me. Bellarmine's very cautious. Again, by the way, Bellarmine is an actual Catholic saint, great scholar, man of immense learning. He basically says, if it is, we need to handle this with care, because the Council of Trent basically says you can't go against the unanimous traditions of the fathers of the church, as the ancient church fathers. You have to uphold these traditions, and therefore, okay, this may be a fine thing to, as he says, save appearances for now. Until it's actually demonstrated and shown to me, I'm not going to believe it till then. And I mention this because this is actually a defensible position in 1616, 1630. As you see, in 1632, it's still very well defensible. Because what's going on here is that Aristotelian framework for things is breaking down. Galileo's made these awesome discoveries, but he hasn't created a framework in which to put all this together yet. Now, what happens is after 1616, he stays away from it. And in fact, he'll publish a book in 1623. I didn't put it on there. Oh, too bad. Called The Assayer, in which instead of talking about the specific issue, he's going to give a polemic about his idea of what science is. And I'll read this because this is very important. He's so influential. This is where he talks about primary and secondary qualities in terms of mathematics. This is the key passage here. Philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. But the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. Here's the key passage. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it, unquote. Again, what he's saying here basically is to understand the universe, you have to know mathematics at a high level. And if you don't have a right to talk about it. Only people with this expert knowledge that I have can do that. Now, he also had another friend, Galileo did, in Rome, was a cardinal named Maffeo Barberini. What happens in 1623, the same year he publishes that book, is that his friend Barberini gets elected Pope. He becomes Pope Urban VIII in 1623. And oh boy, I don't have time for this, but Urban VIII was a serious piece of work. An interesting guy in a lot of ways. I mentioned before that Renaissance popes had one big problem, and it wasn't sex, it was nepotism. He may have been the biggest nepotist of them all. There was not a useless relative that he did not put into a position of authority somewhere in the church. He was well-meaning, though. He wasn't a bad. He's the guy who hired Bernini to do the columns. And long story, he's big into art, aggrandized his family a lot. Oh, I have to tell you one story about Urban VIII. He actually took metal, I think he took metal beams from out of the Pantheon. The Pantheon is this old Roman temple that was turned into a church in Rome. It's an ancient, building, goes back to the Roman Empire. And some wit posted an epigram throughout the city after he did this, because he was usually Renaissance humanist, didn't like this, robbing these ancient Roman glories. And the epigram went, what the barbarians didn't do, the Barberini did. Which I've always liked. The barbarians destroyed all this stuff. They didn't do it, but this Barberini Pope did. Anyway, Urban was interested in these questions. And in fact, Urban VIII, as a cardinal, had opposed the actions of the Inquisition in 1616. In other words, he had a key ally now, who was the Bishop of Rome, who is both, of course, the head of the Catholic Church. He's also a Renaissance prince, has money, of course, he doesn't need it now, but he's got this backer here. So he goes to Rome in 1624 and meets with him. And after several interviews, gets permission from the Pope and the Inquisition to write a book comparing the two systems, the Aristotelian, the geocentric, the heliocentric. And he was actually asked to write it by the Pope. The Pope actually suggested the title to him. The Pope was good to him, in other words. And what he did, Urban VIII, was ask Galileo to give arguments for and against these two things, but not to advocate, for he knew what Galileo believed, not to advocate for heliocentrism. He also made another request. He also asked that his own views he had written on the subject be included in Galileo's book, which Galileo did, and which he published 8 years later in the work, which, if you don't know the background to my slide here, is actually an image of his book, The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. What he did, however, kind of basically went against everything the Pope asked him to do. It comes across pretty clearly as advocating for the heliocentric position. To make matters worse, in the dialogue has these, it's like almost like a play with different characters talking. There's a character in the dialogue named Simplicius, who defends the Aristotelian view, the geocentric view, who makes several errors, gets caught in his own mistakes, and kind of comes across as an idiot. In fact, the name Simplicius in Latin means fool. What's worse than this, the Pope's arguments that he liked, he actually put them in the mouth of Simplicius. And the argument, by the way, that he liked, Pope Urban VIII, was that God could have made the universe any way he liked and then made it still appear to us the way that it does, which is not much of an argument. So I can see why Galileo wanted to mock it. But he mocked the person who actually asked for the book, who was trying to be fair to him. We still don't know why Galileo did this. Apparently wasn't malicious. It was really stupid, though, because Urban did not take it, a very thin skin. He did not take kindly to this at all. And this was public ridicule. So he convened a special commission to examine the book, make recommendations. The commission found that Galileo had not treated the Copernican theory hypothetically and recommended a case be brought against him by the Inquisition. He is called to Rome in 1633 again, and he is tried by the Inquisition. During his first appearance, he is confronted with that 1616, whatever you want to call it, there's debates about this, directive forbidding him to discuss the Copernican theory as if it had been proved true. You can do it hypothetically, not if it was a thing that already proved. In his defense, he produced a letter from Cardinal Bellarmine, by then dead, stating he was only admonished not to hold or defend the theory. In any case, the case came to an impasse. Eventually, something that amounts to a sort of negotiated plea, if you like, Galileo confessed to having overstated the case. And then the Inquisition handed out a sentence with basically three parts to it. One, he was required to recant his heliocentric ideas, which he did. The heliocentric idea, the idea that the sun was stationary, was condemned as quote unquote formally heretical. But basically, they never did actually condemn the proposition itself. Formally heretical doesn't mean totally untrue. It just means as it hasn't been proved. The actual quotation out here is, quote, the proposition that the sun is in the center of the world and immovable from its place is absurd, philosophically false, and formally heretical because it is expressly contrary to Holy Scriptures. And the converse is that the sun's not revolving around the earth. That's a key thing to note here, that they basically condemned him for teaching this as if it were true. They had never condemned it as a hypothesis. Secondly, he had ordered that Galileo be imprisoned, was later commuted to house arrest. This is something that usually gets, myths are made out of this too. There's a book written a few years ago called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths. They didn't go to jail, trust me. And they could have, but people got off a lot worse from the Inquisition in the 17th century. His offending dialogue was banned. And later on, it was decided that none of his books should be published. After briefly staying for a while with the Archbishop, with a friend of his, was Archbishop of Siena, he was allowed to return to his villa near Florence, near his daughter, who was a nun in a convent there. And he spent the remainder of his life there under house arrest, which is to say, in a sweet villa outside of Florence. That's basically it. Where he kept on working until he went blind. And that is essentially the story of the Galileo affair and his condemnation. So, okay, gets condemned. We know the outcome. We know the outcome, right? He was right. The church was wrong. Okay, so how does this get solved in the first place? The problem, right? We talked about this. Oh God, you have this, all this new data. What's the person that solves this is not Galileo, is of course Sir Isaac Newton. I should have put his name up there. Newton. I figure you know who Newton is, right? Like fig Newtons. No, the great Sir Isaac Newton. And he is the person. His dates for his life, by the way, are 1643 to 1727. You don't even know all the dates. He is the person who finally fuses together many of the strands that have been developing since the discoveries of the 16th century. And puts this all together. He basically creates the framework that replaces the old philosophy of nature, more, at least with regards to the heavens, but even more, he really is the progenitor of what we call classical mechanics or classical physics. And he basically takes Kepler's ideas and transposes them into his view, which, by the way, he ignores the theological background because Kepler, it's so wild. Kepler was definitely, he had these weird ideas about how, long story short, he leaves away his theological ideas, not because, by the way, he doesn't have his own. We'll get to that in a second. But he will posit the idea of this mechanistic universe working according to universal laws, universal law of motion, and then the law of universal gravitation, motion and gravity, which mean that, of course, the universe and operating indefinitely. That's the thing, is basically you have a universe which is no longer considered to be, first of all, it's much bigger than previously thought. Regarding that with Galileo, but like he shows how that is. And it's infinite, practically in its dimensions, in space, infinitely extended in space and time. And I mention all this, by the way, because I mentioned, Newton gives us our classical view of modern science, I guess. He's also motivated by theological concerns. He's an Arian Christian, meaning that he rejects the doctrine of the Trinity. And this actually has an effect on his work. One of the reasons why this is so related to his work is that, of course, if you accept the absolute uniformity of space and time, God's relationship to his creation becomes problematic if you don't believe in the incarnation, which he doesn't. Incarnation is God becoming man. So, okay, that's how they relate. Well, how do they relate together? And there doesn't seem to be much room for that mechanistic scheme of the universe if you're an Arian, not if you're a Trinitarian, I guess. But this is what led him to invest so much time in alchemy. I mentioned that earlier. He was looking for an alchemical solution to his problems, and that's why he was invested in this stuff. And in fact, his Principia Mathematica, which is the book, it's the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which explains his laws in heavy, mathematical detail, is kind of a prelude for him for his real work, which was the alchemical work on the Bible. Crazy stuff. But it's he that brings all this together and finally puts to rest that older worldview and world picture in many respects. Now, to return to, well, before we get to that, returning to things, what about Galileo and the Catholic Church? And the war between religion and science. John Paul II in 1982 famously apologized for Galileo or something. And it didn't actually remove his works from the Index of Prohibited Books till the 1830s. So Catholic Church, bunch of morons, right? Not exactly. After Newton's discoveries proved him right, by the early decades of the 18th century, Newtonian physics was being taught in Catholic universities. In fact, the philosophy of Descartes, which had once been put on the Index of Prohibited Books, was being taught in Catholic universities by the 1730s. And by the 1730s, even though it was still prohibited to be taught as true, they had already relaxed rules for the discussion of heliocentrism. And in fact, much later in 1893, Pope Leo XIII openly acknowledged what Galileo had claimed about the Bible, that it was not a scientific authority on the natural world. Doesn't mean it has nothing to say about the natural world, but it cannot be scientific in the modern sense. So why that? And by the way, I should mention virtually every other modern science that was developed in the early modern period was taught in Catholic schools and universities with no problem. So why this one? And the reason is I kind of hinted at in Robert Bellarmine's judgment on this. When he was cautious, he died in 1616, so he didn't live much longer. Been better if he had, or Galileo. The main objection of churchmen who were opposed to this in the Galileo affair, besides ones who had genuine scientific objections, and there were, we'll come back to this in a moment, was it raised the question of the reliability of the Bible and the faith of its adherents. None of the other sciences touched so directly upon this until you get to Darwin. And trust me, the Catholic Church has handled that with kid gloves ever since because of the bad press that Galileo. And now look, these people had power, these cardinals, the Pope, all this stuff. Of course, anything that sort of threatens that would be bad for them. But I don't think you can doubt that despite whatever institutional embarrassment might have been involved because they had been teaching the geocentric theory, its concern about the possible effects of this scientific discovery on the faith of its adherents was genuine. That was their job. And you have to remember something about this. This is in the 1630s, smack dab in the middle of the 30 Years' War. When in their minds, for a whole century, there have been people trying to undermine the faith, Protestants. So you have this sort of, clash going on. They were trying to protect people from ideas they thought might have repercussions on them. Right or wrong, that was their view. Of course, people didn't like the Catholic Church, immediately picked up on this. From the time the trial ended, Protestant propaganda sprang up about the tyranny of Rome. Later on in the 18th century, you're going to have philosophes, Voltaire and Jean de Libert, proclaiming this was the greatest disgrace in the church's history, stuff like this. Then in the 19th century, this will become one of the founding myths of this quote unquote war between religion and science. That historiography, which continues with us today, unfortunately, by the likes of people like John Draper and Andrew White, who were both Protestants, by the way. Even though they were they meant traditional religion, They thought of Protestantism as being modern for some reason. I don't know why, but this, of course, comes down to us too. Again, I'm not going to bash any more new atheists here, but you get the idea. That's where that thing comes from. In fact, of course, what you have seen here, I think, is something different, like I've described. This is not, in fact, a war between religion and science. Again, this is a war within the scientific community at the time, as we call it that. There are people on, again, it has nothing to do with that, by the way, with Catholics and Protestants. There are Protestants who accept the new, Kepler was a devout Protestant, he was a Lutheran, if I'm not mistaken. But people like Francis Bacon didn't. This had nothing to do with that. The people, if you want a bad guy in this scheme, it's probably the hidebound philosophers, Aristotelian philosophers in the universities. They wouldn't budge on any of this, because they were. But on the other hand, it's not as if Galileo had proved his point. This is the key thing to keep in mind. In 1633, the church's assertion that his thesis hadn't been proved was correct. He had a lot of great data, but he had no new framework in which to fit it and make sense of it. It would wait till Newton to get that. And of course, it takes, it took 50 years before someone could validate his theories that way. Half century more for Newton to do that. And in fact, people have pointed this out, some of the arguments he made in favor of the heliocentric position in the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems were totally wrong. One of his big arguments, for example, in favor of this was his theory of the tides. He argued that the Earth's rotation around the sun was what caused the tides, and that as a result, there was only one high and low tide every day, which, by the way, is complete nonsense. And everybody knew it at the time. Like, look, like every illiterate sailor would know there's more than one tide in day, right? And when people pointed out his math was wrong, he just insisted the opposite. Galileo could be kind of an arrogant guy. In fact, of course, we know, and people suggest at the time, the real cause of the tides was what? The moon. What did Galileo think of this? He called it childish and occult. But of course, his critics couldn't prove that exactly either. In fact, it wouldn't be till the 1830s before you could definitively disprove his silly argument in the mathematical way modern science has to do. The point is, not everything can be decided all at once in scientific endeavor. Sometimes truth is the offspring of time, and there's nothing you can do about it. But at the time, the church's position was defensible. And in fact, Galileo's was probably less defensible. In fact, it was probably wrong in the sense that he hadn't proved his point. Not that he had disproved the earlier one, but that distinction matters. So to wrap things up, not too long, what about the Galileo affair with the stuff we've already talked about? And we're talking about in the 17th century with this crisis of expertise, this crisis of knowledge. I'll make 2 points. One, in an era when things are uncertain and when bodies of knowledge that have been stable for a long time have broken down. Well, and they're actually even in quote unquote normal times. Trust is probably a more important thing in human society than knowledge. In fact, that's not the best way to put it. The better way to put it is you can't have knowledge without trust first. There was a book written 35 years ago. I'm so old, 1986, called Leviathan and the Air Pump. It was written by a couple of historians of science. It was about the air pump, the famous air pump that Robert Boyle created in 1661. And it was part of his propaganda campaign to convince everybody that, by doing scientific experiments, by coming up with an impartial data through this experimental method, that's how you would build a true picture of this modern scientific method. Lots of people agree with, a lot of people disagreed with him. One of the people who did was a guy named Thomas Hobbes. You may have heard of him. He's the sort of Leviathan, that's the title of the book. And he pointed out that it would do no such thing. In other words, just by conducting experiments wouldn't prove that your method was true. No amount of empirical data is going to prove that the scientific method is true. That's not philosophical in Hobbes's mind. In other words, put this way, what fact can you discover through the empirical method that will prove that the empirical method is true? And the answer is, it won't. You simply have to accept certain philosophical, metaphysical principles as being true for it to make any sense whatsoever. And that's what Hobbes pointed out to him. Nobody cared, nobody agreed. And everybody agreed that, and one of their points in the book was the reason why people went with Boyle and listened to him rather than to Thomas Hobbes. Boyle was a Christian. He was the ideal Christian gentleman. Whereas Thomas Hobbes, of course, was a materialist, which, if you don't know, you can technically be a materialist and not be an atheist. But in the 17th century, if you were a materialist, you were an atheist. And they thought he was like Satan. He had a bad reputation. In other words, not because they rejected his arguments, but because he was icky. He was social poison. He was socially contagious. They just ignored him. And this is a point of one of the authors of that book, Stephen Chapin, wrote a book about trust, is that shared knowledge that people can actually use together in community depends on social trust. If you don't have that, you can't have any knowledge. You just have a war of all against all, I guess. And finally, one other thought from the modern philosopher, Paul Feyerabend, I think that's how you pronounce his name, wrote an article on Galileo called Galileo and the Tyranny of Truth, in which he argued that there are basically two types of experts. And he goes back to the ancient Greeks when he's talking about this, but he says there's basically one type of expert which says, because I have special knowledge, because I have special expertise, I'm the only one who can have any authority on this subject. Nobody else can proclaim on these things but me, because of my expertise. That's the first type of expert. The second type of expert is the kind that it has specialized knowledge, but has to be accountable to other people in the wider society. And the reason being, he traces this idea back to Plato, by the way, if you're wondering, the idea being that, well, a specialist is only responsible for his specialty. He only knows this real narrow thing that he knows. And he doesn't have a larger perspective on the wider world. And therefore, they should be held accountable by other people who are responsible for what the larger view of things is. Go back and remember that little quotation I gave you from Bertrand Russell about the narrowness of the type of knowledge that modern science gives you. At least from my perspective, I think this makes a lot of sense. Feyerabend's notion that on the one hand, you do want experts to have a domain of their own, but on the other hand, beyond that realm of their expertise, I think it makes sense to say they probably should have other people keeping them accountable to the wider world. And of course, in the 17th century, you could say the church was, again, actually, that's what Feyerabend says about Galileo. He was the first expert. Galileo wanted wanted astronomers alone to say what the passages in the Bible about the earth and the sun meant, without interference from the church. And the church was the second type of expert. They were in charge of the faith of everybody else. In any case, it's a mess in the 17th century, as it is a mess today, as it often is in human history and in European history. So that is our lecture on Galileo. And so next lecture will be on the culture of the Baroque, culture in a time of crisis in the 17th century. So hope you guys get a lot out of this, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care, y'all.